The road no one travels twice. There's a road that cuts through the Ashfin lowlands that nobody uses anymore. The merchants rerouted their caravans after the Ironblood clan claimed the eastern ridge. The border guards stopped patrolling it after 3 of their men came back without their weapons and 1 came back without his boots. The mapmakers still draw it, a thin gray line pressed between the marshland and the stone hills, but they've stopped labeling it anything useful. No waypoints, no inns, no distances. I traveled it anyway. Not because I was brave, not because I was stupid, though plenty of people who knew me would have argued the point. I traveled it because I had 37 jars of honey resin salve, a wagon with a cracked left wheel, and a contract with the Ironblood clan that was 3 weeks overdue for delivery. My name is Edric Vane. I'm a medic trader, the kind of man who walks the edge between the human settlements and the non-human territories because nobody else will, and because the kind of work that gets done in that space, moving medicines, brokering healing supplies, sometimes just sitting with someone who's dying and has no one, tends to pay well when it pays at all and tends to cost everything when it doesn't. I'd been doing this for 9 years. I knew the risks. What I didn't know, as I guided my horse around the second bend of the Ashfin Road, was that the Ironblood Queen had been wounded 2 days ago and hadn't told anyone. Let me tell you how I got into this line of work, because it matters for understanding what happened next. When I was 17, I wanted to be a cartographer. I had a gift for maps, not just for drawing them, which anyone with a steady hand could do, but for reading them, for understanding what the space between places meant. The way distance was never just distance but always also time, weather, season, the state of whoever was doing the traveling. My father thought cartography was a reasonable career for a boy with no property to inherit and enough intelligence to avoid becoming a problem. My mother thought I should marry the innkeeper's daughter and help run the common room. The innkeeper's daughter had specific and serious opinions about a great many things, including me, and none of them were favorable, so that path was never as available as my mother believed. I studied cartography for 2 years at the settlement school in Harwick. It was during those 2 years that I started traveling the territories outside the main human settlements, drawing supplemental maps of the roads and trails that the official surveys hadn't bothered with, the paths the merchants made when the main roads flooded, the tracks through the marsh that the border clans used, the passes through the stone hills that the Ironblood warriors walked so regularly that the rock itself had been worn smooth. It was during one of those surveying trips that I watched a man die of an infected wound. He was from a settlement 2 days east of Harwick, a non-human settlement, a mixed community of hill folk and lowland orcs that had been there for 3 generations, that traded with the human towns and paid the same road taxes and mostly got along. He had come into Harwick with a wound on his leg that had been festering for a week. He'd wrapped it himself, with cloth that wasn't clean, the way you do when you don't know what else to do, and you're hoping the problem resolves itself. He went to the medic's hall. The medic's hall in Harwick was a proper building, stone floor, good light, shelves of medicine, a trained staff of 4 practitioners. It was, by the standards of a settlement that size, well equipped. I had been inside it to get my own cuts treated, to buy the antiseptic solution I carried on my surveys, to ask questions about the medicinal properties of plants I'd found in the territories. The man stood outside it for an hour. I watched from across the square. I was drawing a map of the settlement's main roads, something that didn't require much attention, and so most of my attention was on him. No one let him in. One of the practitioners came to the door at some point and said something I couldn't hear, and the man responded and the door closed. He sat down on the steps. He sat there for another 2 hours. His leg was visibly swollen by then. I could see it from across the square, the way the cloth wrapping was being pushed out by the inflammation underneath. He died on the steps. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony. He simply stopped being conscious, and then he stopped breathing, and it was a while before anyone came to deal with the body, and the whole time the medic's hall door stayed closed. I stood in the square with my half-drawn map, and I understood something with the complete clarity that only comes when a thing is undeniable. I understood that the world I was living in had decided that some people's wounds were not worth treating, and that this decision was so normalized that 4 trained medical practitioners could watch a man die on their front steps and consider it an unremarkable afternoon. I tore up the map, not dramatically. I just folded it in half and tore it along the fold and dropped it, and I walked to the settlement school and told them I was changing my course of study. Cartography was about knowing where things were. Medicine was about whether people lived when they shouldn't have had to die. I chose the one that felt like it meant something. 9 years later, I was a medic trader on the Ashfin Road with a cracked wagon wheel and a supply contract for the Ironblood clan, and whatever the 17-year-old version of me had expected life to look like, it was probably something like this. A specific kind of weariness that's also a specific kind of satisfaction, a constant calculation of routes and supplies and relationships, and a deep familiarity with the truth that most of the work worth doing in the world happens in the places nobody thinks to look. I heard her before I saw her. Not a cry. Orcs don't cry out when they're hurt. They breathe differently, a kind of controlled exhale that sounds like wind through a cracked door. I'd learned to recognize it years ago from an Ironblood elder who'd let me reset his broken shoulder in exchange for 2 jars of the salve I was now carrying. He'd sat absolutely still the entire time, breath coming in those measured, pressurized gusts, and when it was done, he'd looked at me with something that wasn't quite respect but was adjacent to it and said, "You work without flinching. That's useful." I'd taken it as a compliment. The breathing I heard now was the same, controlled, precise, expensive, like someone spending their composure one careful exhale at a time. She was sitting against a boulder at the side of the road, half hidden by the shadow of the rock face. She was enormous, as Ironblood Orcs tend to be. Ironblood clan ran larger than most, broad through the shoulders, heavy with muscle, their skin a deep gray-green that lightened at the jaw and darkened at the knuckles. She was dressed in leather armor that had been cut open at the left side, and the wound beneath was deep enough that I could see it from 10 feet away. She was also watching me with her hand on her axe. "I'm a medic," I said. I kept my hands visible. I'd learned this the same way I'd learned about the breathing. "I have supplies, I'm not a threat." "You're human," she said. Her voice was low and flat, the kind of voice that doesn't waste energy on inflection. "I am," I agreed, "but human hands can still close a wound if you'll let me try." She stared at me for a long moment. Her grip on the axe didn't ease. "Why?" she said finally. It was a real question. Not suspicion, well, suspicion too, but underneath that, genuine bewilderment. The kind a person feels when something happens that doesn't fit any pattern they know. "Because you're bleeding," I said, "and I have what you need to stop it. That seems like a sufficient reason." Another pause. Then slowly she moved her hand away from the axe. "Do it fast," she said, "and don't speak more than necessary." I worked for almost 2 hours. The wound was bad. Something had gone in deep at the side, probably a blade, not a clean cut, but a tearing kind of damage, the kind that happens when the blade goes in at an angle and then gets pulled out wrong. She'd packed it herself with dry moss, which had slowed the bleeding but was starting to cause problems of its own. Moss is useful in emergency situations. It has mild antiseptic properties and it absorbs well, but it isn't a substitute for proper wound care, and leaving it in was going to cause trouble within another day. I cleared it carefully. This required removing the packing in sections, which is slower than pulling it out whole but causes less disruption to the tissue that's trying to seal around it. I talked her through what I was doing, not because she asked, but because I've found that people human and otherwise tolerate painful procedures better when they understand what's happening and why. Most practitioners don't bother. I bother. She didn't respond to any of it. But she didn't tell me to stop talking either, which I took as tolerance. I cleaned the wound with the antiseptic solution I kept in a sealed flask, good quality distilled solution, not the cheap diluted version that was common in the settlements. Then I packed it with the honey resin salve before stitching. The salve had to go in before the stitches, because once the wound was closed you couldn't get it in properly, and the salve was what would keep infection out over the next several days. She didn't make a sound during any of it. When I was done, I sat back on my heels and assessed my work. The stitching was clean and even. The bleeding had stopped. The salve would do its work. "You'll need to rest," I said, "at least 2 days before you travel hard. The stitches will hold if you don't strain them, but the tissue underneath is still raw and the body needs time to rebuild what was damaged." I looked at the wound, then at her. 3 days would be better. 2 is the minimum. "I heard you," she said. 2 days. She was looking at me differently now. The wariness was still there, but it had shifted, moved from the front of her expression to somewhere behind it, making room for something else. Assessment, maybe. The particular kind that reassigns someone from one category to another. "You're the medic trader," she said. "The one with the supply contract." "Edric Vane," I confirmed. I was on my way to make the delivery. "The delivery is 3 weeks late." The road was flooded for 2 of them and my wheel cracked on the 3rd week. I paused. "I can produce documentation if that's required." Something moved across her face, not quite amusement, something drier. "My name is Ura," she said, "second daughter of the Ironblood line, a beat, and now I am the Ironblood Queen." I absorbed this. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said. She looked at me sharply. "My mother died in battle," she said. "It was an honorable death. It is not something to grieve in the way your people grieve." "I understand," I said. "I meant the weight of what came after, the throne, the responsibilities, those are a different kind of loss." She was quiet for a long moment. "Yes," she said finally, "they are." She said it without self-pity, which I appreciated. Just a statement of fact about the shape of the thing. I helped her back to the Ironblood settlement the next morning. She didn't ask for help, but she didn't refuse it either, which I'd come to understand was approximately the same thing for someone like her. I walked beside her, matched her pace, and didn't make the mistake of trying to support her weight unless she shifted toward me, which she did twice, and which I handled without comment. The path up the ridge was steep enough that it would have been difficult for anyone who'd been sitting against a boulder for 2 days, with a significant wound in her side. She walked it without complaint, at a pace that suggested she was working hard but would die before she showed it. The settlement was carved into the eastern ridge, not built on it, but into it, chambers and passages cut deep into the stone and reinforced with heavy timber. The Ironblood clan numbered about 400 in total. They were all large. They all looked at me with expressions that ranged from neutral to actively hostile. Their queen walked past them without looking at any of them. I followed her inside, and no one stopped me. Part 2, the 7 days. I stayed for a week. Officially, it was to monitor the wound. Unofficially, or rather, additionally, it was because the Ironblood clan had a significant shortage of medical knowledge and a significant surplus of wounds. A raiding dispute with a neighboring clan had left 17 warriors in various states of damage, and while orcs healed faster than humans in some respects, infection didn't care about species, and neither did the complications that arose from improperly treated injuries. Ura permitted me to treat her people on the 2nd day. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. "The others are injured. You will treat them." Not a question, not exactly a command either. A statement of what was going to happen, offered to me as information rather than instruction. I did. She stood and watched the first treatment, an infected cut on a young warrior's forearm, with the absolute focused attention of someone cataloging every decision I made. The warrior's name was Goruk, and he was perhaps 19, broad even by Ironblood standards, with the particular stillness of someone who has been told since childhood that showing pain is a choice, and has internalized this completely. His forearm was in bad shape. The infection had been going for 4 days. The surrounding tissue was inflamed in a way that suggested it was spreading, and the original wound had been packed with nothing at all. I worked for 40 minutes. I talked through what I was doing as I had with Ura. Goruk didn't respond either, but I noticed after about 10 minutes that the set of his shoulders had changed, slightly less prepared for something unpleasant, slightly more resigned to something merely tedious. This was progress. When I was done, Ura said without emphasis, "Do the others." I did. By the 4th day, I had a working space set up in a room near the settlement's entrance. Warriors came to me in 1s and 2s. They didn't say much. They let me work. When I handed them instructions, keep this covered, don't submerge it in water, come back in 2 days, they listened in a way that suggested they would actually follow through, which was more than I could say for most of my human clients. Human clients had a tendency to decide they were better before they were better and behave accordingly. Ironblood warriors apparently decided that the medic had given an instruction, and the instruction would be followed. It was, from a professional standpoint, extremely refreshing. Ura checked on me twice a day. She didn't hover. She walked through, looked at what I was doing, asked 1 or 2 direct questions, and left. On the 3rd day she asked me what antiseptic solution I was using and why I preferred it over alternatives. On the 4th day she asked me what the difference was between an infection that would respond to the honey resin salve and one that needed something stronger. On the 5th day she asked me nothing and simply watched for longer than usual, and then left without speaking. On the 5th day, when she was gone, Goruk looked up at me from where he was sitting with his freshly rewrapped arm and said, quietly, "She's been doing that since you arrived." "Watching," I said. "Learning," he said. "It's what she does. She watches until she understands the whole of it." He looked down at his arm. "She's going to make someone teach her surgery one day. I'm fairly sure of it." "I'll volunteer," I said. He looked at me with the expression of someone processing an unexpected response. "You would," he said finally, which seemed to close the topic to his satisfaction. On the 5th evening, Ura sat down across from me while I was grinding dried root for a pain reduction paste. "Why do you do this work?" she said. "It needed doing," I said, "and I was good at it." "You're good at it," she corrected, present tense. "Yes. But there are safer ways to use that skill. Human settlements, cities." She looked at the grinding bowl in my hands. "Why come out here, into clan territory, into the territories that your people consider dangerous?" I thought about how to answer this. I'd been asked versions of it before, by the border guards who thought I was reckless, by the merchants who thought I was foolish, by my family who had stopped asking and started treating my choices as a closed matter that didn't require further discussion. "When I was 17, I said, I watched a man die of an infection that I could have treated. He was from a non-human settlement 2 days east of my hometown. He'd come into town to try to find a medic. No one would see him. I kept grinding. He died in the street outside the medic's hall. I was there. I watched it happen." I set the bowl down and looked at her. I decided that was something I didn't want to be part of, the world that let that happen, so I trained. And when I was done training, I went where the work was. A pause. "This is where the work is." Ura was watching me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. "You changed your life," she said, "because of something you witnessed." "Yes. Because it was wrong. Because it was wrong and I was in a position to respond to it being wrong, and not responding felt like a form of participation." I looked at the grinding bowl. I wanted to be able to look back at my life and know I'd been on the right side of it. She was quiet for a long time. "You are an unusual human," she said finally. "I've been told that," I said. "It's usually not meant as a compliment." "It is from me," she said. She stood and left, and I sat there for a moment with the grinding bowl in my hands and a strange quiet warmth that I couldn't entirely account for settling somewhere in my chest. On the 7th day, I told her I needed to leave. She walked me to the ridge path. It was early morning, the valley still holding the previous night's cool, the sky pale and clean above the stone hills. I explained the wound care instructions for the 4th time. She accepted them with the patience of someone who has already memorized everything, but understands that the repetition is what the speaker needs, not the listener. At the ridge path, she stopped. "Edric Vane," she said. I turned. She was standing with her arms at her sides, which I'd come to understand was her version of a relaxed posture, but there was something in her face that I hadn't seen before, something careful, something that had been decided before it was spoken. "Will you come back?" she said. It was a plain question. No inflection, no weight added to one side or the other. But it cost her something to ask it. I could tell, the way you can tell when someone says a thing that required them to cross a line they'd been standing at for a while. She wasn't someone who asked things she wasn't sure of the answer to. "Yes," I said, "I'll come back." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she nodded once, the small, precise kind that meant something had been confirmed and would be remembered. "Then I will remember that," she said. I walked down the road. I didn't look back because I was fairly certain that if I did, she would be standing there still, and something about that would make it harder to leave, and I had places to be and people waiting on medicine. I walked down the road, and I told myself I'd be back in 3 months. It took 11. Part 3, The Gap That Grew. This is the part of the story where I have to tell you something that doesn't reflect well on me. I came back, but not in 3 months. The autumn rains came early and they were brutal. The Ashfin lowlands flooded so badly that you could boat across what had been farmland in September. I spent 3 weeks stranded in a riverside town with 17 other travelers, and nothing to do except treat the respiratory illness that spread through the flood shelter, and tell myself that Ura had the salve and the instructions and her people around her, and she would be fine. When the floods receded, I had a backlog of contracts that needed to be fulfilled before the deep winter set in. I worked through it. I told myself I'd get to the Ironblood Ridge before the first snow. I didn't. The first snow came 2 weeks early. The Ashfin Road was buried under half a meter of it by the time I got close, and I'd lost my horse to colic in October and was traveling on a borrowed mule that absolutely would not go up the ridge path in those conditions. I turned back. I told myself I'd go in early spring. Spring came, and with it, a fever outbreak in the western settlements that needed more hands than they had. I went. I told myself that the Ironblood clan was well provisioned, that they had survived long winters before I'd ever heard of them, that Ura was not someone who needed me. All of this was true. None of it made me feel less like I had done something wrong. The thing about a broken promise is that it doesn't stay in one place. It moves. In the first weeks after you don't keep it, it's a small thing, an intention that didn't quite connect with reality, a gap that can still be closed. But the longer it sits, the more it becomes a fact about who you are rather than a circumstance you're in. I'd made a promise. I hadn't kept it. That was a thing I'd done. And the reason it mattered was that the promise had meant something when I made it, and it still meant something, and the meaning didn't reduce just because I was busy. I knew this. I kept knowing it through the winter and into the spring and through the fever outbreak and into the summer. It was almost 11 months to the day after I'd walked down that ridge path when I finally made it back. The summer was warm, the road was dry, and I had no excuses left. I had 3 crates of supplies and a wagon with 2 working wheels and no reason not to go. The Ashfin road felt different, or maybe I was different. I'd spent 11 months telling myself the promise wasn't important. It was just something said at a parting, a politeness, the kind of assurance you give someone when you mean I hope to rather than I will asterisk. And I'd spent 11 months knowing that wasn't what I'd meant when I said it. I had meant it. I had meant asterisk I will come back the same way I meant most things I said. Fully, without qualification, with the weight of intention behind the words. And 11 months of not coming back had not changed what I'd meant when I said it. It had only made the gap between the meaning and the reality larger. The closer I got to the ridge, the heavier the gap felt. The settlement looked different from the outside. More activity, a new structure near the entrance, what looked like an expanded storage area cut into the lower rock face. There were children running along the lower path who stopped and stared at my wagon with the frank curiosity of children who haven't yet learned that staring is complicated. Gorak was at the top of the ridge path. He saw me before I saw him. He didn't say anything. He just turned and walked back inside. I took that to mean he was announcing my arrival, which seemed better than the alternative. Ura was in the central hall. It was the largest room in the settlement, a broad stone chamber with a long table down the middle and a fire at each end. There were a dozen Ironblood warriors in it, seated and standing, and all of them looked at me with the kind of attention that made the air feel slightly heavier. Ura was at the far end of the table. She looked exactly the same. No, that's not quite right. She looked like more of herself. The month since I'd last seen her had added something to the way she held the room, not authority exactly. She'd had that already, but a kind of settled certainty, the way a tree looks different when it's put down deeper roots. She was queen in a way she hadn't quite been yet when I'd met her, still new to the title, still finding its edges. Now she wore it without thinking about it. She was looking at me. I couldn't read her expression. "Edric Vane," she said. Her voice was the same, low, flat, precise. "I'm back," I said, not the most eloquent thing I'd ever said in my life, but it was true, which felt like it mattered. "You are," she agreed. "I'm late," I said, "by about 8 months. I should have been here before the first snow and I wasn't, and I know that, and I'm not going to explain it in a way that sounds like an excuse, because the truth is that other things kept coming up and I let them keep coming up when I should have made this the priority." The room was very quiet. Ura looked at me for a long moment. "Then come," she said. She stood. "Walk with me." She took me out through a back passage I hadn't been through before, a narrow corridor that opened onto a ledge overlooking the eastern valley. The valley was extraordinary, a long bowl of green cut by a silver river, and beyond it the dark line of another ridge, and beyond that the sky going blue and enormous. We stood there for a moment without speaking. The wind moved along the ledge. Below, a hawk was making large, slow circles above the river, and I watched it because watching it gave me somewhere to look while I waited. "Were you afraid to come back?" she said finally. The question surprised me. I considered it honestly, the way she'd probably expect. "Not afraid," I said. "Ashamed. There's a difference. Afraid is about what happens to you. Ashamed is about who you are." I looked at the valley. "I didn't want to come back and find that you were disappointed. That I'd made something smaller by not keeping the promise." "Something," she said, "not someone." "That too." She was quiet for another moment. "I was angry," she said, "when the winter came and you did not." A pause. "Not because I required anything from you. The medicines I had, the instructions I followed. The wound healed cleanly, exactly as you said it would." Her hands were at her sides, precise and still. "I was angry because I had believed you." "I know," I said. "I don't give trust easily," she said. "I gave it to you because you earned it. In 7 days, which for me is a significant pace. I gave it to you because you worked on me without hesitation and talked me through it and didn't flinch and didn't make it about anything except the work." She was looking at the valley. "And then you were absent for 11 months. "Yes." She turned to look at me. "Why are you telling me this without defending yourself?" she said. "Humans make defenses, they explain, they offer reasons and circumstances." "I have reasons," I said. "I just don't think they're sufficient. There's a difference between an explanation and a justification, and I don't have the second one. The floods were real. The cracked wheel was real. The fever outbreak was real. And none of them required me to stay away for 11 months. Some of it was circumstances. Some of it was choices." I met her eyes. "I came back, that's what I have." The wind came again, smelling of stone and pine from the ridge above. "I thought about you," Ura said. It was quiet, those words, quieter than the wind. "When the winter was bad and there was fighting on the northern border and I was making decisions that would decide whether people lived or died, I thought about what you said when I asked why you do this work, that you decided what kind of world you didn't want to be part of." She looked back at the valley. "I think about that when I make decisions. What kind of queen I don't want to be. What kind of world I am building when I rule." I didn't say anything. I understood that the space needed to stay open for a moment. "You influenced me," she said, "without being here. That's unusual." "I'll try to influence you more usefully from closer range," I said. Something changed in her expression. That thing that lived near the edge of a smile, that had no name in any language I knew but that I had thought about, in the 11 months I'd been away, more than I'd intended to admit. "You intend to stay longer this time," she said. "As long as you'll have me," I said. "I have contracts through the season, but none that can't wait a few weeks, and I think there's more work here than anywhere else I've been. Your people, the surrounding territories, there's a radius of need here that I've barely touched." A pause. "If you'll permit it." She looked at me for a long moment. "I'll permit it," she said. Part 4, The Weight of Earned Ground. What followed was 6 weeks. 6 weeks that I would carry for the rest of my life, not as a specific set of memories, but as a quality. The amber light of the stone halls in the evening, the wind on the ridge at night, the particular silence of the Ironblood clan, which was not empty but full, packed with a communal understanding that didn't need language to sustain itself. I worked. I treated wounds and set bones and taught what I knew to Gorok, who had been thinking about medicine since my first visit, and had apparently decided that he was going to learn it with or without my cooperation. He had remarkable hands, steady and precise, with an instinctive understanding of pressure that took most apprentices a year to develop. I taught him how to read a wound, how to distinguish between inflammation that was part of healing and inflammation that signaled something going wrong, how to do a proper debridement without causing more damage than you were fixing. He was a better student than most of the people I'd tried to teach in the human settlements. He asked the right questions, specific, directed, always aimed at understanding the principle rather than just the procedure, so that he could apply the principle to situations the procedure didn't cover. "You want to understand the logic of it," I said, after his third particularly well-aimed question in a row. "So that I can work without you," he said, direct, no apology for the implication. "Good," I said. "That's exactly what you should want." He looked at me with the expression he sometimes got when he was recalibrating something. "Most teachers want you to need them," he said. "Most teachers are afraid," I said. "The goal is for you to be able to do this without me. That's what teaching is for." He went back to the wound he was working on, a clean cut on a younger warrior's forearm, simple enough to be good practice. And I watched him and said nothing, because he had it, and the best thing I could do for him in that moment was get out of the way. I reorganized the settlement's medicine stores on the 2nd week. They'd been accumulating supplies for years without any system, which meant some things were spoiling and some were out of stock, and nobody knew exactly what they had until they needed it and discovered they didn't. I made a proper inventory. Ura stood behind me for an hour while I worked through it and asked questions in her direct, systematic way, and I answered them. And by the end she had understood the logic of the organization well enough to maintain it herself. She spent another 2 hours the following day, redesigning the storage layout based on that logic. When I came in and saw what she'd done, I stood in the doorway for a moment because it was better than what I would have done. She'd applied the principle and then extended it, accounting for factors I hadn't considered about how the settlement-specific workflow moved through the space. "You didn't need me for this," I said. "I needed the initial information," she said. "After that, no." She looked at the reorganized shelves with the satisfaction of someone who has solved a problem correctly, but it's faster with 2 minds than one. I thought about that for a moment. "Yes," I said, "it is." We had evenings. This wasn't something I'd expected. The Ironblood were not, as a culture, given to social performance. No feasts, no ceremonies for the sake of ceremony, no particular traditions around communal gathering that I could identify beyond what was functional. But Ura had a habit of sitting near the fire in the central hall in the late evening, and I found that I was welcome there if I arrived quietly and didn't demand conversation. Most evenings we sat in silence, and it was comfortable in the specific way that comfortable silence requires, a shared ease with the absence of words, an understanding that nothing needs to be filled. I had friends in the human settlements who couldn't tolerate 5 minutes of silence. Ura seemed to consider it a reasonable state. Sometimes she asked me things, about medicine usually at first. Then, gradually, other things. What the human settlements were like in different seasons, whether the flood damage had been repaired in the lowlands, what I'd heard about the southern territories and their politics. I answered everything as honestly as I could, including when the honest answer was I don't know or I've heard different things from different sources, and I'm not sure which is accurate. She seemed to appreciate the uncertainty flagging. "Most people tell you what they know and what they think as if both are the same thing," she said once, "not about anything specific, just an observation." "It's a useful distinction," I said. "Yes," she said, "it's one I try to enforce with my advisors. They don't like it, because it requires them to be less certain in front of you. Because it requires them to be less certain in front of themselves," she said. "That's the harder part." Sometimes I asked her things. She answered with the same directness she applied to everything, no softening, no hedging, but not unkind. She told me about the northern border dispute and how she'd resolved it, not by force, but by identifying what the neighboring clan actually needed and negotiating from there rather than from pride. She told me about her mother, not grieving, as she'd warned me, but matter-of-factly, the way you might describe a teacher whose methods you respected. She made decisions quickly and she was usually right, and when she was wrong she said so and changed course, and this made people trust her rather than resent her asterisk. She told me that her mother had ruled for 30 years, and that she herself expected to rule for at least that long if she didn't make significant errors in the next 2. 2 years is when clans fall or hold, she said. Early rule. The first 2 years are when the clan decides whether the new leader is real. "You're in year 1, I said. "Yes," she looked at the fire. "It's going adequately." I thought but did not say. That adequately seemed like a profound understatement. What I'd seen in 6 weeks was a leader who worked at a level of precision and dedication that I'd rarely encountered, who made decisions without hesitation, but who always explained them clearly to the people they affected, who absorbed every piece of information available to her and integrated it quickly, who demanded much of her people but more of herself, who had already resolved one territorial dispute peacefully and was in the process of negotiating a second. I thought she was extraordinary. I kept this thought to myself for a while, because she was a queen in her first year of rule, and I was a traveling medic with a limited warrant to be sitting in her hall in the evenings, and certain things needed to be earned before they could be said. On the 38th day, one of the clan's children fell from the eastern ledge. It was not a long fall, 1.5 meters, maybe 2, but the landing was on stone and the child hit badly, shoulder first, and was unconscious by the time I got to her. Her name was Vreka. She was perhaps 8 years old, and she'd been climbing something she'd been told not to climb and had learned why. I spent 3 hours assessing the damage, monitoring her breathing, watching her pupils, checking for signs that something had shifted inside that I couldn't see from the outside. Her shoulder was dislocated and I said it, which was straightforward. The concussion was the worry. Concussion in a child is different from concussion in an adult. The stakes of getting it wrong are higher. The margin is narrower. The indicators you're watching for need more careful interpretation. I didn't leave her side. Ura was there the entire time. She didn't interfere. She stayed back, she didn't crowd me, she didn't ask questions that would slow me down. But she was present, steady, and completely still in the way she was always completely still, watching with the same focused attention she brought to everything. When I needed something from my kit, I didn't have to ask twice. When Vreka's mother arrived, and the sound she made threatened to destabilize the working space, Ura was there in 2 steps, a hand on the mother's shoulder. A few quiet words I couldn't hear, and the stability returned, and the mother sat down against the wall and waited. The child woke up 3 hours after the fall, confused, nauseated, in pain, but conscious and tracking, her pupils responding correctly, her answers to my questions making sense. I told her to stay still. She stayed still. I told her she'd need to be watched through the night. Ura had assigned 2 warriors before I finished the sentence. I sat back against the wall of the healing room and let myself be exhausted for a moment. Ura came and sat beside me. We were both looking at Vreka, who had fallen back asleep. The mother was beside her, holding her hand. "She'll be all right," I said. "I know," Ura said. "I could see it in how you worked. When the outcome is uncertain, you work a certain way. When it is not, you work differently." She paused. "I've been watching you long enough to know the difference." "I know you've been watching," I said. "Does that bother you?" "No," I said. "It's one of the things I stopped." She looked at me. "One of the things I like about you," I'd been about to say. It was true and it was specific. The quality of her attention, the way it was complete without being intrusive, the fact that she watched because she was genuinely interested rather than because she wanted to find something to use. I'd been around people who watched like that, and it made you feel like a resource being assessed. She watched like someone who thought you were worth understanding. "One of the things," she prompted, "one of the things I find valuable about being here," which was true and also a careful retreat. She held my eyes for a moment. Something moved in her expression, awareness, I thought, of the retreat. She didn't press it. She looked back at the child. "I like that you came back," she said quietly. It was simple, no performance. Just the truth offered plainly. "I should have come sooner," I said. "Yes," she agreed, "but you came." The fire in the corner of the healing room crackled once. Outside, the night wind moved along the ridge. The mother beside Vreka breathed in the slow pattern of someone who has finally let go of fear. We sat there until I was sure the child would sleep through till morning. Part 5, What Stays? On the 42nd day, I told her I needed to go. She walked me to the ridge path again. It was late afternoon. The valley below was going golden, the river picking up the light and breaking it into pieces. The wind had the first edge of autumn in it, not cold yet, but hinting. 3 months, I said. This time I mean 3 months. Not 11. I know the difference, she said. I know you do. We stood there a moment. The hawk I'd seen on my first day back, or one very like it, was making its circles above the river again. I'd started thinking of it as a reliable thing, a landmark of this particular view. Ura, I said. She looked at me. I came back because I wanted to, I said. Not just because I'd promised. Both were true, but I want you to know that the wanting was real. It was real when I made the promise, and it was real every time I didn't come, and I was aware of it not being acted on. I held her eyes. I want you to know that. She was quiet for a long moment. I know, she said. I have known that for some time. You didn't say anything. You were working, she said. And I was waiting. For what? She looked at me with the same direct precision she applied to everything. For you to say it, she said. I held her eyes. I'll be back in 3 months, I said. And when I come back, I'd like to stay longer. If that's something you'd want, properly longer. I'd need to restructure how I'm working, but it's possible. I've been thinking about it. Define longer, she said. I'd base from here for part of the year, I said. Run the routes out and return here rather than traveling continuously. Some of the contracts I could transfer to other traders. There's a younger woman, Aelith, who's been looking for established routes. The Eastern Circuit I could run from here without much difficulty. I was thinking out loud. If the clan is willing to have a human around regularly, if you're willing. I am willing, she said with no hesitation. The clan will adapt. They already have somewhat. Gorak told me I work efficiently, I said. Significant approval, she confirmed. Something moved in her face. He also told me that you said the goal of teaching is for the student to not need the teacher. I did say that. He approved of that as well. A pause. He's harder to impress than he appears. I know, I said. I take it seriously. She looked at me for a moment with an expression that was doing several things at once, most of which I couldn't name precisely, but which included something that had been building across 6 weeks and was now near the surface of her face in a way it hadn't been before. Edric, she said. It was the first time she'd used only my first name. Yes, I said. Come back in 3 months, she said, and bring yourself, not just the supplies. I always bring myself, I said. You bring the medic, she said. Bring the rest of it too. I looked at her. The rest of it is already here, I said. Has been for 6 weeks, probably longer. She held my eyes for a long moment. Then she nodded, once precise, the way she nodded at something confirmed and settled. Then I'll be waiting for all of it, she said. I walked down the path. This time I looked back. She was standing at the ridge's edge, and the valley was behind her, and the late light was on her, and she was one of the most extraordinary things I'd ever seen. She raised one hand, not a wave, but a deliberate gesture, an acknowledgement. I raised mine. Then I turned and walked, and I started counting the days. Part 6, the third return. 3 months later I came back. Not 3 months and 2 weeks. Not 3 months and 4 days through circumstance. I gave myself buffer time, left early, took the longer road that avoided the drainage problem near the Ashfin Junction, arrived with half a day to spare. I came up the ridge path, and Gorak was at the top of it. He looked at me, he looked at the sky, he said, "You're early." "Half a day," I said. "She didn't say anything, but she's been up since the 4th watch," he said, which from Gorak was approximately a 16-sentence speech about the emotional landscape of the situation. He nodded, apparently satisfied that he'd communicated what needed to be communicated, and walked back toward the entrance. I followed. Ura was in the central hall. She stood when she saw me. This was new, she usually let me cross the room. But she stood, and she walked toward me, and when she stopped in front of me, the distance between us was close enough that all the detail of her was very clear. The gray-green of her skin, the dark eyes, the precise set of her shoulders, the thin scar along the left side where the wound had been and had healed cleanly. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and there was a moment that didn't need any words because everything in it had been said, had been building since a road that nobody travels and a boulder in the shadow of a rock face. "You're early," she said. Half a day, I said. I noticed, she said. I wanted buffer time, I said, in case of mud. Was there mud? Some, not much. A pause. I came early because I wanted to. She looked at me for a long moment. Good, she said. She reached out and put one large hand against the side of my face. It was not a gentle touch. She was Ironblood. She was not built for gentleness in the way humans use the word, but it was careful, precise and deliberate and warm. You are going to stay, she said. Yes, I said. You have restructured the contracts. I have. The Southern Loop goes to Aelith starting next season. The Western Circuit I'm transferring to a colleague who's been running it alongside me anyway. I'm keeping the Eastern routes, which are all within range of here. I looked up at her, a long way up. She was a head taller than me in my boots. I'll be traveling still, but I'll be coming back. Here, she said, not a question. Here, I said. Her thumb moved against my jaw, one slow, deliberate motion. There is something I want to tell you, she said. Tell me, I said. When I asked if you would come back, she said, almost a year and a half ago on that ridge path, the first leaving, I asked because I had already decided that I wanted you to. Not as a medic trader, not as someone useful to the clan. She looked at me directly, as she always looked at everything, with the full and complete weight of her attention. I asked because I had decided in 7 days that you were someone I wanted in my life. I breathed. I'm not easy, she said. I don't accommodate well. I don't change what I am for the comfort of others. I am the Ironblood Queen and my people come first, and this is not going to change. She held my eyes. And still, I agreed. Her thumb moved again. Then stay, she said. Not as a guest, not as a contractor, stay. I reached up and put my hand over hers. I already have, I said. That first time, 7 days in, when you sat across from me while I was grinding root and asked why I do this work, I was already staying. I just had some roads to finish first. Something changed in her face. That thing that lived near the edge of a smile, that had no name in any language I knew, but which I had thought about more than I'd intended across a year and a half of circling toward this moment. You could have said so then, she said. You were the Ironblood Queen, I said, newly crowned. I was a medic trader who just met you. It seemed presumptuous. It was, she said. But I would have liked it. I laughed quiet real, the kind of laughter that doesn't perform itself. I'll keep that in mind, I said, for future presumption. Do, she said. She didn't move her hand. I didn't move mine. Outside, the evening was coming in across the valley, the ridge wind starting to pick up, the fires at both ends of the central hall burning low and warm. There were warriors in the hall. There were always warriors in the hall. None of them were looking at us, in the deliberate way of people who have collectively decided not to look at something. There is a lot of work to do, Ura said finally. There is, I agreed. Gorok is ready to advance his training. I want to look at the northern border settlements. If you're in dispute with them, they probably have medical needs similar to what you had when I arrived. Building that relationship could be useful on multiple fronts. The Eastern Valley has 2 settlements that have never had a medic at all, she said. I didn't know that. I know you didn't, she said. I've been saving it. A pause, something in her tone that was, in its own dry, precise way, almost playful. Incentive. I looked at her. You were strategizing about how to keep me here. I was identifying what would be most compelling, she said. There's a difference. There really isn't. No, she said, there really isn't. She let go of my face. I let go of her hand. We stood a foot apart in the central hall with the fire on both sides of us, and the evening coming through the passage openings, and the Ironblood clan conspicuously occupying its own attention all around us. Come, she said, I'll show you the changes we made to the healing room. Gorok had ideas. Did they work? Most of them, she said. The ones that didn't, I corrected. We walked toward the healing room side by side, and somewhere behind us I heard, very quietly, a sound that might have been Gorak exhaling. A long, controlled, expensive breath. The kind that in Ironblood physiology apparently can mean satisfaction as easily as pain. I didn't turn around. But I smiled. Epilogue, what the road knows. I've lived on the Eastern Ridge for 6 years now. It took some adjustment. The Ironblood warriors who'd been tolerant in the first visits took longer to warm, not because they became hostile again, but because they were careful, in the way that people who don't extend trust easily are careful about the specific trust that comes with someone being permanently present. A visitor can be assessed and found acceptable. Someone who stays gets assessed differently, by different criteria, over a longer time. It took about a year before I stopped being assessed and started being included. The signal was small. A senior warrior named Dorak, who had given me the most consistently neutral expression of anyone in the settlement for 11 months, came to me one morning with a shoulder problem that had been bothering him for weeks. He didn't say anything about it when he arrived. He sat down, pulled his tunic aside, and looked at me. That was all. I treated it. It took 3 sessions over 2 weeks. At the end of the 3rd session he said, "Good work," and left. Gorak, who had been in the corner pretending to inventory supplies, said nothing, but his shoulders had the look of someone who was not smiling but had made the choice not to. I decided that was the moment I had been accepted. The work expanded. The Eastern Valley settlements had needed a medic for a generation. I established a route that covered both of them on a rotating schedule, training local people in the settlements to handle common injuries, so that the gap between my visits didn't cost anyone their life. Gorak came with me on the first 3 circuits, then ran them independently. He was better at the community work than I was. He had a directness that the people in those settlements found more comfortable than my humanness, a shared framework of physical culture and pain management that let him establish trust faster than I could. I trained him to train others. The logic compounded. By year 3, there was a network of medically trained people across 8 settlements in the territory. None of them formally credentialed, all of them practically capable, all of them connected to each other through Gorak and through the system of knowledge I'd built and left with them. People were living who would not have been living 2 years before, not because of anything dramatic, but because of the simple absence of preventable deaths. I kept a rough count. I tried not to let the count become something I held too tightly, because then it became about me rather than about the people in the count. But I kept it, because the 17-year-old who'd stood in a square in Harwick watching a man die on the medic's hall steps needed to know that the choice he'd made had meant something. It had. Ara ruled. She did it the way she did everything, with precision and without wasted effort, and with more quiet consideration than anyone looking at her from the outside would guess. She had the manner of someone who had already decided and was now executing, which meant that watching her make decisions looked like watching someone do something inevitable. But I knew, by year 2, by year 3, the hours that went into each decision before the manor took over, the late evenings in the hall after everyone else had gone, the questions she asked me and Gorak and her senior advisors, the way she sat with uncertainty long enough to map it before she let it become certainty. She had resolved 6 territorial disputes in 6 years without military action. This was unprecedented for the Ironblood, not because they were violent by nature, but because the traditional resolution framework was coercive, and she had decided, very early, that coercive resolution created problems that delayed themselves rather than solved themselves. She was right. The territories that bordered the Ironblood Ridge were more stable than they'd been in a generation. She built 2 trading agreements with human settlements. The second one had been difficult. A settlement elder who thought he was negotiating with someone who needed him more than he needed her, who adjusted his understanding of the situation slowly over 3 meetings, and who came out of the 4th meeting with an agreement that was fair to both parties, and with the expression of someone who had not expected to respect whoever he was negotiating with, and now did. I was present for part of that 4th meeting. Not as a participant. I was there because my medical credentials gave me a reason to be present, and her advisors had suggested that a human in the room might make the settlement elder more comfortable. Ura had neither confirmed nor denied that this was a strategy. It was a strategy. She was an exceptional negotiator. She was also, in the specific and particular way that only exists between 2 people who have decided to spend their lives in proximity, someone who knew me better than I knew myself in some respects, and who used this knowledge with characteristic precision. When I was overworking, she said so. Not gently, she didn't do gentle exactly, but directly, in the way that made the statement hard to deflect. You haven't slept properly in 4 days and you are less effective because of it. This is a medical fact and you know it. When I was being too cautious in my training with Goruk, holding on to knowledge that he was ready for, she named it. You're not done teaching him, but you're also not starting the next stage. Why? I want to make sure the foundation is solid before. The foundation is solid, she said. You know it is. What else is this about? It was about the fact that Goruk was going to be better than me at some of this, and that the part of me that had spent 9 years being the one with the knowledge found that prospect uncomfortable even as the rest of me knew it was the goal. She had identified this in 10 seconds and said it plainly, and I had nothing to do with it except agree. Yes, I said. Good, she said. Tell him what he's ready for. I did. In the evenings, we still sat by the fire. This had become something I thought of as one of the things that defined the shape of my life. The way some things become structural through repetition, not because they're dramatic, but because they're reliable. The fire in the central hall, the wind on the ridge, the valley going gold in late afternoon and silver in early morning, the sound of the settlement settling into itself at night. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we sat in silence that neither of us needed to fill. Sometimes she asked me about the routes I'd been on and I told her, and she stored the information in the same systematic way she stored everything. Because information about the surrounding territory was always useful to a queen, and she had never fully stopped treating every conversation as potentially relevant data. Sometimes I asked her things, about the decisions she'd made, about how she thought about the future, not immediately, not next month, but the shape of the next decade, the next generation. What do you want it to look like? I asked once. The territory in 20 years. She thought about this for a moment, which meant she was either genuinely uncertain or constructing an answer precise enough to be worth saying. Stable, she said. The disputes resolved, not delayed. The settlements connected by trade rather than separated by suspicion. People living longer because they have access to medicine and to each other. A pause. What you're building, but larger. What I'm building, I said. What we're building, she corrected. Don't be modest, it's inaccurate. I looked at her. 20 years, I said. I'll be in my mid-50s. Is that relevant? She said. No, I said. I suppose it isn't. She looked at the fire. Orcs live longer than humans, she said. Not a statement of grief. Just a fact, offered as she offered most facts, plainly expecting me to take it in and place it correctly. I know, I said. I have thought about it, she said, what it means for what this is. And I said. She was quiet for a moment. It means I am going to have more years of this than you have at the end, she said, and that I have decided this is still worth it, because what is here while you are here is sufficient. A pause that meant the word wasn't quite right. More than sufficient. And the years after will be what they are, and I will carry what I carry from this, and that will be worth more than the alternative. I looked at her. The alternative being a life without this, I said. Yes, she said. I reached over and took her hand. She let me. After a moment, her fingers closed around mine, not tight, not desperate, deliberate, the way she held everything she intended to keep. We sat there by the fire, and outside the ridge wind moved against the stone, and the valley was dark and enormous below us, and I thought about 17 years old and a square in Harwick, and a decision made in grief about what kind of world I didn't want to be part of. And I thought about how decisions have consequences you can't predict, how a choice made out of refusal, I will not be part of this, can travel a long way from its origin point before it finds what it was actually heading toward. I had refused a world that let people die on steps, and the refusal had carried me down a road that nobody uses, toward a boulder and a breathing that sounded like wind through a cracked door, toward 7 days and a promise and 11 months and a return and a choice to stay. Toward this. The thing about the road. The Ashfin Road still runs between the marshland and the stone hills. The mapmakers still draw it with no waypoints and no inns, that thin gray line. But if you travel it now, you'll find that it's better maintained than it used to be. The drainage problem near the Ashfin Junction has been cleared. The worst stretch of mud near the ridge path has been packed with gravel. Small things. The kind of things that make a difference to someone traveling regularly between places. The Ironblood settlement on the eastern ridge has a healing station now. It's a proper room, good light, organized supplies, a training space for the students Goruk brings through. The clan's medical knowledge is better than most human settlements I've visited, and the knowledge is maintained by people within the clan rather than depending on anyone from outside. I like that most. I am still a medic trader. I travel the eastern circuit. I come back. The promise I made at a ridge path in the early morning, a year and a half after I'd watched a man die on the steps of a medic's hall and decided to do something about the world that allowed it, that promise held. Not immediately, not without failure, but it held because the wanting underneath it was real, and real things have a way of finding their way through, even when everything else gets in the way. Even down the roads that nobody travels. Even back to where they were always supposed to be. And